This is the After Mass podcast, and today is the seventh Sunday in Ordinary Time. And today we're going to be talking about the Golden Rule, loving your enemy, the Judge Not Discourse, the Saint of the Day, Saint Polycarp, and a miracle discussion around the Loretto Chapel Staircase. So our readings from today are from Samuel, Corinthians, and the Gospel of Luke, and I'll tie into the first two readings here in a moment. The Gospel of Luke to kind of place us where we are in the beginning still of Christ's ministry. He's kind of just started preaching. He has a small following. He's just started calling out to his apostles, but he's here on this plain alongside the ocean, and he's giving a sermon to the people all seated there on the grass. And so I kind of want to talk about the context here of what he's talking about, because it's a pretty loaded gospel today, sort of the context of when it was spoken and sort of applying that to your own life. So for a moment, picture yourself there in the crowd. Again, we've got a crowd of people, maybe a few hundred people, all seated on the grass, listening to this guy speak. And again, this is kind of the beginning of his preaching ministry. People have heard of Jesus. Maybe your friend told you about him. So, hey, this guy, he understands the scripture very well. You should hear this guy preach. There's talk of miracles happen when he's around. There's something to this guy. We need to go listen to him speak. And so, you with your friends, you all go down there. You see a group of people. It's probably mostly people you recognize, people from around your town, maybe people you're related to, and you're all huddled together to listen to this guy speak, because what you're looking for is you are looking for a Messiah that's been prophesied to come. You're looking for someone to come and liberate you and establish a kingdom, and you probably are thinking of that as like a physical kingdom on earth that you want because you don't want to be under Roman rule anymore. And so you've all come together to listen to this person speak. But when he starts preaching, you don't really get the warrior king that you were looking for, because he starts off by saying, hey, turn the other cheek. If someone strikes you, turn your other cheek and let them strike you again. If somebody takes your cloak, also give them your tunic. If someone borrows money from you, don't expect to get that money back, right? And then the golden rule comes about: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so right out the gate, you're getting a message that you sort of were not expecting. When it comes to like turning the other cheek and someone steals from you, so give them the rest of what you have, that seems like a very defeatist, cowardly, surrendering type of life, where you're probably wondering, what is this guy talking about? Because again, the laws at the time are sort of eye for an eye. Hey, this guy screwed up, stone him to death. It was a lot more justice oriented, I guess you could say, not quite as nice and merciful. Today, we take all this stuff for granted. Oh, the golden rule, everybody knows that. At the time, though, it was a lot more significant. It was a lot more unheard of. And so that idea, right, of turning the other cheek, we think of that today kind of in the same line of taking the high road. Somebody's doing something mean or abusive or childish or whatever. And so you simply say, I'm not going to engage with it. I'm going to take the high road and be the bigger man and all that stuff. But that's not quite the same thing here. This is more playing an active role in your own abuse, right? Where he's not just saying, hey, somebody strikes you, just forgive them and move on. It's saying, when somebody strikes you, turn the other cheek and be struck again. When someone steals from you, give them the rest of what you have. It's definitely more active than passive, which is odd. And the only way that I can think of it is sort of like marking it as a departure from the material world, right? Where it's not just not being materialistic or just not having a lot of things where it's like, hey, I'll give you my cloak too. But it's more so being detached from, I'm a person and this is another person I don't like, and we have these little conflicts between each other, and he hit me, so I'm going to hit him back and all that stuff. It's more of saying, I recognize my place in the world. I'm a child of God. This material abuse, this material suffering, these material things don't matter to me. I recognize this other person who's abusing me, also a child of God. And so I'm not going to be spiteful towards them. I'm not going to be hateful towards them. I'm going to offer myself to them. So it's not surrendering like to your enemy. It is surrendering yourself to Christ on the bigger level, right? Of recognizing, hey, my place in the world is down here, right? And so is this other person's, but maybe they don't recognize that. But my place is down here. And that, of course, ties into the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which also ties into, of course, the greatest commandment, right? Is, love God with all your strength and everything that you have. Also love your neighbor as yourself. And so from all these different declarations of how we're supposed to treat our fellow man, I think you do get that idea that you're not supposed to just think of them as another person, right? And sort of as the reading from Corinthians talks about, it's not just an earthly person, but there's two parts. There's the earthly part and the spiritual part. And so you can't just live an earthly life, right? You have to be focused on the spiritual also. And not just when it comes to others, but in your own life too. Because in order to love your neighbor as yourself, the prerequisite there is that you do love yourself and you're able to forgive yourself. All of that's very important so that you can extend that out to other people and hope that they extend that out to you. And part of that is recognizing your place in the world. It is having some humility and being somewhat detached from this physical material world, which is definitely easier said than done. Especially, again, the context of the time for those specific readings. When we're talking about like forgiving your neighbor or treating your neighbor kindly and people around you, these communities, most of them, are quite small. It's usually people that you know or work with directly. It's people, a lot of them are family or extended family. A lot of this is very close knit. And it's saying like, hey, these people are your people. You need to treat them kindly. You need to forgive them. You need to love them, treat them how you want to be treated. Because these people are important. This is your world. Your world is quite small, right? And it's a good idea to take care of your world, right? You definitely don't want to be talking bad about people that you know or that you're related to or that you interact with on a daily basis. Just not a good practice. Just don't do it. Treat them kindly and hopefully they will treat you kindly in return. Nowadays, that gets a little bit trickier because of how interconnected everybody is, and every person and every conflict is just directly remoted into people's pockets and in front of their face. And so that extension of loving your neighbor goes out to pretty much the whole world. When really, if you take like the context at the time to today, the context of your neighbor back then would be like your immediate family and your coworker. But now it's the whole world is become our neighbor essentially, which makes it a little bit more difficult. So back to sort of the context at the time, being there in the crowd. You just heard him say, hey, turn the other cheek when people abuse you, treat your fellow man how you want to be treated. And maybe you're saying, okay, that's not quite what I was expecting, or that's kind of profound. I hadn't thought of that before. And then he hits you with the, don't just love the people who are nice to you. You also need to love your enemies, which again, today you're probably like, yeah, okay, sure, I've heard that 1,000 times. But at the time, that was quite profound. That was kind of disruptive to average life because they had rules on the books. You do something wrong to me, I get to return the favor to you. This person sins, put them to death. It was very much a justice-oriented, I guess you could call it justice-oriented laws on the books about this stuff. There were my people and there are your people, right? We're not friends. We don't like each other. Stay out of my way or I'll kill you. We're looking out for ourselves. Especially, again, in the context of the time, these people aren't just living in a community out somewhere and they're just Jews doing their own thing. They are under Roman rule, and the threat of an uprising, the threat of a rebellion is real. It is high. Pontius Pilate, one of the main things he's there to do, overseeing the region, is to not have an uprising happen. He needs to maintain the peace as best he can. And we see people, at Jesus' trial, we see people like Barabbas when they say, hey, who do you want? Do you want Jesus or do you want Barabbas? And people say they want Barabbas. Well, Barabbas was a revolutionary. He had led a violent revolution that obviously didn't work. But the threat of revolution, the threat of unrest amongst the people is high and tangible, right? And the people here are looking for a leader. They are looking for someone who can overthrow their rule and establish a kingdom for them. That's what they want. And so the message of loving your enemy is definitely not what they expected to hear, because it's saying, what, I got to love the Romans too? I got to love the non-Jews also? And of course it applies internally or on a smaller scale also of, loving that neighbor they don't like or that tax collector who screwed them over. That does apply too, but on a larger scale, it is setting the expectation that Jesus is not the warrior king that these people are expecting and that they believe him to be for a long, long time, really up until the very end. So this immediately puts Jesus in a position that people were not expecting, right? Because again, their laws at the time don't reflect that. And human nature doesn't really reflect that, right? As human beings, if somebody treats us badly, our reaction is to also treat them badly, to hold a grudge, to get even. That is very human. It's very normal for us to want to do. And that's kind of how things were and how things went up until that time. That's just kind of the law of the land. It's how things went. But Jesus is here to say, not anymore. We are not going with just human, earthly, normal desires. We're not going with what's convenient as a human being with our own emotions and reactions. We are setting a standard for a spiritual purity. We're setting these standards of what you should be living up to. Because you were made in God's image, you should strive to be as close to God as you can. So this is how things are going to go. It may not be easy. You may not like it. It may go counter to what you believe or what you expect or how you would normally behave. But hey, here is what is expected of you. And it's certainly not easy, right? He's not saying, hey, just be vaguely kind to people. Hey, just if someone's bothering you, just ignore them and move on and go about your day. Again, he's not saying to be passive. He's saying you need to actively love that person and actively pray for that person, which is a lot more difficult than ignoring them, because you can ignore people pretty easy. The average person that like cuts you off in traffic or whatever, 5 minutes later, they're totally out of your mind. Even like annoying coworkers, you can probably ignore for the most part and forget about them. When it comes to like social media or politics or stuff, you can literally just turn the TV off or turn your phone off and ignore it, and it goes away and you don't have to think about it anymore. It's a lot harder to actively think about those things and actively attempt to view them in any sort of compassion. This is true for me too, obviously for everybody, right? We all have people or whatever that we don't like, that we actively hate or we choose to ignore because we can't stand them, that we need to be actually actively praying for and working towards loving and forgiving and extending some grace and kindness out to, which again, much harder, much easier said than done, but that's kind of the whole point I think that Jesus is making, is that he's setting these standards that you're not going to hit, definitely not every day, but it is a daily surrender to try and achieve these things that we know we're probably not going to achieve. It goes against our human nature, but we know that these things are sort of on a higher level. They are above us. It's what we've been called to do. So we need to try and do it. And I see pretty often certain people, Catholic people or Christian people, who say that, oh, I love certain, controversial figures or whatever. I'm thinking specifically of Jesse Lee Peterson, if you know who that is. Funny guy. He's definitely, I don't know if he's technically even Christian, given some of the things that he's said, but he'll say stuff like, I love Hitler or I love whoever, and people usually will freak out about that. But really, I always think like, look, this guy, he's a little out there, okay? I don't quite agree with a lot of what he says, but that sentiment, at least, is accurate. The people that are evil, the people that are bad, you are still supposed to love them as a child of God, as you yourself are also a child of God. Loving someone does not mean condoning everything that they do. It does not mean accepting everything that they do. Anybody with children knows that. You can love your children and really not like how they behave or not like the decisions that they make or anything like that, but it's still a love that you have for them as a parent, right? And so similarly, I think you are supposed to have a love for everybody, every person out there. Even if you don't like what they're doing or who they are or really anything about them, there needs to be a base level detachment from that and a recognition of your place in the world and how you both are on the same plane. You're both sinners, you're both children of God, you're both heading in the same direction, hopefully. You both hopefully have the same end goal of where you want to end up. Even if one of you is terribly misguided, you are not supposed to turn your back on them because you wouldn't want them to turn your back on you in your time of need. Even if you don't know that it is your time of need, even if you don't think you need anything, you still want these people to be there for you. And then from here, we get into the big one. We get into the judge not discourse, right? Judge not lest you be judged, condemn not lest you be condemned. And the judge not, that is probably the most quoted scripture in the entire Bible. Probably, I think that's probably right. But in my experience at least, it is mostly quoted by non-Christians at Christians as a sort of, I guess you could say like a purity test. I guess you could say like as a condemnation, where it's like, again, usually non-Christians saying like, hey, this is how your Bible says you're supposed to behave. You're not behaving that way. So anytime there's a Christian who's passing judgment on somebody, saying like, hey, this person's lifestyle is wrong, or anything about, say, like abortion or LGBT stuff or anything else like that, they're like, hey, you can't have an opinion on that because you're a Christian and the Bible says not to judge. So you shouldn't be judging other people's lifestyle or anything like that because the Bible says so. And of course, these people are doing that most times in bad faith. They don't believe in the Bible. They've never read the Bible. They don't know anything about Christianity. They've just heard that verse before. And so they're using it to bludgeon you and cudgel you into passiveness, into silence, hoping that they can use your beliefs against you to get you to shut up and permit evil to exist. The question is, though, are they right? Are we, as Christians, called truly not to judge other people? Well, I mean, look at the readings. It obviously says, do not judge, lest you be judged. So it seems pretty open and shut. As Christians, we're not supposed to judge anybody. We're not supposed to call out any sin when we see it. We're supposed to just be quiet and vaguely kind to one another, and we need to be tolerant and inclusive, and we could never call out anybody when they're doing anything wrong because that would be judging, and hey, we're not supposed to do that, right? Obviously not. So what exactly is this saying when it says judge not? What do we mean when we say judge in this context? So with the English language, we have words that can have multiple definitions or they can mean slightly different things given the context in which they're spoken. And so it can create a little bit of ambiguity or a little bit of confusion, especially when the word is just written. That adds a little bit more ambiguity to it. And so when we come to a word like judge, I think we're just going to use or think of it in the way that it's most often or commonly used, which is judging someone in the terms of like, I observe somebody and then I think something negative about them. Like I'm walking around, I see some person with like a half-shaved head, blue hair, and a face tattoo, and I think to myself like, what a freak, something like that, right? That's me judging that person just because of what I observe on them, how they look, maybe how they act, their lifestyle, something about them like that I'm thinking or commenting on negatively, judging an action or a lifestyle. And everybody does this. We probably do it multiple times a day. It has no real consequence, right? Of course, if you say it out loud and that leads to like a confrontation or something, that's one thing. But if you're just thinking these things about somebody, judging somebody, there's really no effect to that because you don't really affect change in that way. You can't just think something and have things change. The other type of judge that I think that in this context we're referring to is like an actual judicial judge. Someone who, whenever they judge you, whenever they pass judgment on you in like a courthouse or something, there are actual consequences. There are actual effects to that. You can go to jail. You can have rights taken away, whatever it may be. They can alter or change your world because they have authority whenever they speak, whenever they pass judgment. And so in the context of this judge not discourse, I think it's that type of judgment, judging with authority, and that's like judging somebody's soul, right? Not just judging an action or a lifestyle that they have, but actually judging their soul and declaring, like, hey, this person is going to hell. This person is evil. This person cannot be saved. That type of judgment is what's being referred to, which I think makes sense. You look back at the reading from Samuel, and one of the things that David says is, no man shall destroy what the Lord has anointed, referring to their decision to not kill Saul. And I think more broadly that is saying, you as a human being don't get to take the Lord's authority onto yourself. God has plans in motion for everybody. God's running the show. Recognize your place in the world as a child of God, but you're not on his level. Don't try to get on his level. Don't try to assume his authority. And then we go back to the times when this was spoken, and that does make sense. That's pretty consistent with what Jesus teaches. He does not like moral grandstanding. He doesn't like people who brag about the good things that they've done. He doesn't like people who want the whole world to see what a good person are and how much they're suffering and how much they're praying and offering up this holier than thou attitude. He's not a fan of. And so from that perspective, we're talking about modern day context of that. The people who do weaponize this against Christians do, to a degree, they do have a point, because there is a not insignificant subsect of Christian people. In my experience, it's mostly older people who do morally grandstand, and they do have that attitude of like, these young people are going to hell, and that sort of thing. You think of the classic, Bible thumping church lady, very fire and brimstone. You screw up, you deserve to go to hell. Not really bought in on the whole redemption thing. I've known people like that personally. I'm sure you know people like that as well. And so from that perspective, they are correct. You shouldn't behave in that way. You shouldn't be passing judgment on someone in that way where you are speaking as if you have some sort of authority over them. It's not coming from a place of love or compassion. It's coming from a place of hatred or cruelty. And so you probably want to avoid that. The other side of that, though, when it comes to actually judging somebody's action, that's totally fine. That's totally acceptable. Not only is that just acceptable, that is what we are called to do, because we're called to spread the gospel, spread the good news, spread Jesus' teachings. And Jesus was not ambiguous in what is morally correct and morally incorrect. He was not ambiguous with what he wants us to do in this earthly life or how he wants us to behave. It's laid out pretty clearly. And so whenever we are to go spread the word, part of that does necessarily involve laying out what is morally correct, morally incorrect, and calling for repentance and correction of the things that are morally incorrect. But it does need to come from a place, I talk about, that detachment and that recognition of saying, I'm a child of God, this person is a child of God. I'm a sinner, this person's a sinner. I'm walking on this path, hopefully leading towards salvation, leading towards heaven, and I'm hoping that this person is also on that path. And so when they stumble, I want to help them up. Whenever I stumble, I want them to help me up. Again, tying back to the golden rule. And from that perspective, of a loving perspective of, hey, this lifestyle that you're living, it's not conducive to happiness. It's not conducive to a good, productive, holy life. And it's leading you down a path that you don't want to go down. That type of judgment, totally fine. And again, it talks about elsewhere in the Bible, right? If your brother's sinning, you are to tell him, hey, you need to stop this behavior. And if he continues to sin, you're supposed to go and get a witness to come with you so that you can tell him in front of the witness, hey, you need to stop this behavior. And then if he continues to sin, you can at least say, hey, I have a witness that knows that I did what I was supposed to do. I did my due diligence of telling him to stop, and he didn't stop. So obviously, as Christians, that is what we're supposed to do. So again, don't be bullied or silenced or anything like that by these people into passiveness. I think a big part of the readings this weekend were about being active in love, active in forgiveness. We're not supposed to live a passive lifestyle, which is difficult because in today's world, again, the world is so big now. It's not just our little community and our little family and people we know directly. Our world has expanded to like the entire globe, and everybody's conflict has suddenly become our conflict, and everybody's business becomes our business. And you could ignore that to a degree, but it always finds a way to seep in, right? And the normal, acceptable thing to do is just to block it out and ignore what you don't want to deal with. But it seems by the readings this weekend that that's not how you're supposed to do it. You're not supposed to just ignore it or block it out. You have to actively participate in it, actively acknowledge it, which is, again, more difficult now than ever. Now I want to talk about the saint of the day. We have Saint Polycarp. Now, Saint Polycarp is one of those names that I've heard like 1,000 times, but I've never actually known who this person is, and maybe you're the same way. So it was actually quite interesting learning about him and how significant he is to the early church. He is part of the second generation of church leaders. He was actually a disciple of St. John the Apostle, and he was the bishop of Smyrna, and he was close friends with St. Ignatius of Antioch, a very important church father as well, who told him at one point, your mind is grounded in God as on an immovable rock. So obviously he was thought of as a very holy person, very imitative of the life of Jesus, and very steadfast in the faith. He was challenged a few times from a few different people. Again, this is like right after Jesus has ascended into heaven. The original apostles are spreading the word. They have some of their disciples, but this is kind of immediately after. This is the very beginning of the church. And so at this time, you did have a lot of heresies springing about. You had pretty much all the things that Jesus did not directly preach about are kind of coming up. Some mysteries are being discussed and some in heretical ways. And so there was a lot of confusion at the time. And it said here that one of these heretical leaders, Marcion, leader of the Marcionites, who followed the dualistic heresy, which is essentially saying, hey, we are body and spirit, but the body is evil and the spirit is good, which of course is not true. We're not inherently evil because we're human, though we are body and soul. This person reached out to Polycarp saying, hey, you need to recognize us, Polycarp. And he responded by saying, I recognize you, yes, I recognize the son of Satan. So sort of a similar response of, Jesus, get behind me, Satan. And that sort of very candid, almost aggressive response to these people that Jesus often had when he was challenged. It was also important enough to meet with the Pope at the time to discuss how and when Easter was to be celebrated, which is pretty significant. But the life of a Christian was not easy in these times. There was a lot of Christian persecution, and Polycarp, being one of the spiritual leaders of Christianity at the time, was definitely known and a target. It says here that during one day when Christians were being attacked by animals in the arena, the crowd was chanting, "Let Polycarp be found." They wanted him to be martyred next. And so the word got to him, and people urged him to go and hide at this nearby farm. And he stopped and prayed on it, and he had a vision of, it says, his pillow turning to fire. And so he declared that this meant that, hey, this means I'm going to be burned alive. Sort of a premonition of his death. And he did hide for a bit, but eventually he was found, and his captors came to take him away. And granted, at the time, he's 86 years old. He's an old man. But the captors come to take him away, and he just asks for some time to pray. So he ends up praying for a couple hours, praying for the whole Catholic Church throughout the world, and afterwards, the guards took him to the arena to be killed. It says here that when he was brought in, there was a voice heard from heaven calling down to Polycarp to be brave. And then he was prompted to renounce Christianity and to swear by Caesar alone. But Polycarp responded by saying, "If you imagine that I will swear by Caesar, you do not know who I am. Let me tell you plainly, I am a Christian." And they told him again, "If you don't renounce your Christianity, you'll be thrown to the animals, so you need to change your mind." And then Polycarp responded, "Change of mind from better to worse is not a change allowed to us." And after that, they declared that he would be burned alive. And so they put him on the pyre. He says a prayer, they burn him alive, and it's said that the fire did not harm him. Instead of burning, it was like he was glowing. After this, they saw that, okay, he's not dying by the fire, so they stabbed him instead, and it said that the blood that flowed from his wound put out the fire. After this, they did not even let the Christians take his body. They did burn his body, though later on, the Christians did go and steal his bones. And it's said this was around 155 or 156. So, St. Polycarp, a very important, influential early church father. Again, this is the second generation of church leaders. These people knew the apostles directly, were appointed by them, and are going out in a very difficult time to counter a lot of the heresies or a lot of the controversies and misteachings about the church, and are working on laying out exactly what the Catholic Church entails. And more than that, here, we know that he was a respected church leader. We know that he spoke against these things, but also he faced his martyrdom bravely, refused to renounce Christ, and was killed for it, as were many at that time. And then on a slightly lighter note, fun fact, St. Polycarp is the patron saint of relief from earaches. I don't quite know how that connects. Maybe I'm missing something. But there you go. You have an earache, reach out to St. Polycarp. Now, on to the miracle discussion for today. We are discussing the Loretto Chapel Staircase, located in Loretto Chapel in New Mexico. This is a miraculous staircase. It's an engineering marvel. It's this spiral staircase that for years now has left architects, physicists, lots of people confused as to how it was constructed, how it stayed in place without ever wavering or breaking after all this time. It's a mystery, and so let's kind of talk about how it came about. So it started when in 1870, Sisters of Loretto wanted to construct a chapel to be built for the girls' school there. And after 5 years of construction, it was built, but the person who was building it, who designed it sort of in this Gothic style inspired by the French, the guy dies. And so it was unfinished. What they were missing was a way to get up to the choir loft, which is like 20 feet up in the air. So they've got this small chapel, they've got a choir loft way high up, and no way to get to it. And so they asked some carpenters, how do we do this? And they came together and they said, hey, we really can't do this. We can't build a staircase in here. It's going to take up way too much space. There's not going to be any seating room because the chapel is quite small. They said, you've got to build a ladder and just climb up the ladder. And they said, not going to happen. We're not doing that. And so they're really at a crossroads, and they prayed. They prayed a novena to St. Joseph, who is the patron saint of carpenters, asking for a solution to the problem. And allegedly, it says on the ninth day of their novena, a man arrived with just a hammer and a few other carpentry tools and offered to construct this staircase in order to reach the chapel. And so, over the next few months, he's constructing it, and he did request that he had complete privacy. And then one day, the guy's just gone. He's vanished, and the staircase is complete. And not only is it just finished, it's this very beautiful, sleek, ornate staircase. It's got two 360 turns in it. It's got 33 steps on it, and it's made with no nails at all. It's just wooden pegs holding it together. And again, there's no center support, and it's doing two spiral 360s. There's no real way that this thing should work. It's engineering perspective, from an architectural perspective, it shouldn't work. It shouldn't stand. Like, all the weight of the staircase is resting on the lowest stair. It doesn't make any sense, and yet it works. And an even weirder part of it is that the wood used to construct it didn't come from New Mexico. They don't know where this wood came from. So you've got this unsolvable architectural problem of this staircase. A mysterious stranger shows up out of nowhere. He's got very basic tools. He uses no nails or anything like that. He uses wood not from anywhere around there. And in fact, people who have looked at it say that there's no quite exact match to this kind of wood anywhere in the world. And he constructs this miraculous staircase that's an architectural engineering marvel that people have come, experts have come to study, and they can't wrap their heads around it. They think that this is ingenious, amazing, no explanation for it. Then the guy just disappears. And again, it's not like the staircase just sits there. Nowadays, it just sits there. But it was used regularly, heavily for a long time. And again, it never wavered, never fell, anything like that. I don't know how you describe it in any other way than a miracle. And I want to bring this up during these shows because I think a lot of the times we think of miracles as something that used to happen. You know, Jesus did miracles, and there's not really that stuff anymore. But stuff happens all the time. You know, miracles like this, maybe not, this extravagant, but miracles and unexplainable things like that do happen all the time. Happens consistently still today. I think it's mostly written off, though. But something like this, you can't really ignore. And sure, you can call into question the official story. You can say, oh, so this guy appeared and built it and disappeared. I don't believe that, yada, yada. But what you can't disagree with is the fact that this staircase, from an engineering perspective, is unexplainable. And the wood it was built out of is also unexplainable. You can't argue that. And if you've got other good examples of things like this, miracles like this, please let me know, and maybe we'll talk about them in a future show. But that is what I have today. Let me know if you enjoyed this podcast. Let me know what I got right, what I got wrong. Let me know who your favorite saint is, and maybe we'll talk about him in the future. And again, do let me know if you have any miracles like this that you would like me to discuss. Thank you, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.